Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to Verité Researchers seminar on an issue that has become quite important, I think, in Sri Lanka today, and is going to come up in the budget as well. It is about the way in which taxes are changed and determined for cigarettes in Sri Lanka. What we'll do today is really talk you through several pieces of work that Verité has done on this issue, and it has published widely and over a long period of time. And everything we will present in today's seminar really will be drawing on different publications of Verité research. And the foundational publication, I think, that looks at the formula for taxation is a working paper, which will be shared on the chat here for those who want to read it. So sometimes you will see that we use different date ranges. It depends on the publication date. But what we hope to do is really set out a rational formula for cigarette taxation that can be adopted by the government in the current budget. Of course, there are others that have been working on it and on similar ideas. So we are very glad to have with us today Professor Amala de Silva, who will be also giving some formal comments. Also, we have with us Harani, Weerasekera, who's an experienced researcher at IPS, who will also be making, I think, formal comments on the presentation we make, and we'll open it up for discussion. So I will invite my colleague Ashwin to share the screen with the slides, and we'll move through a presentation that will set out the problems of cigarette taxation in Sri Lanka, how they can be solved with a rational formula for cigarette taxation. So thank you for everyone who has joined. As you can see, the title, A Rational Formula for Cigarette Taxes, an alternative to ad hoc taxation, is really the problem that we are trying to solve. And of course, it's a little bit technical, but we'll try to keep it as simple as possible. But feel free to come back with questions towards the end. In terms of what the contents for today, I think we will talk about the competing interests in cigarette pricing and taxation, just to give a framework for thinking through this. We'll talk about ad hoc and suboptimal taxation of cigarettes, the history of that, and really focus on point number 3, the formula as a solution, and present the published methodology that Verité published maybe about 3-4 years ago on this issue. And the theoretical framework in this really will deal with the 3 issues that are on the contents page, but I will get to them as we present. We are recording this presentation, but we will not record any Q&A. So by the time we get to the question and answer session, we will not be recording, but the presentation will be recorded, just to let you know, for all those who have joined in. So let me start by talking about the competing interests in cigarette pricing and taxation. And I'm going to break that down into 3 areas of interest. First of all, there is the fiscal interest, that is the social interest and the industrial interest, and I'll unpack each in turn. The fiscal interest is really the social interest is simply that tobacco is harmful to health. Now, large numbers of users have a high probability of earlier mortality due to the consumption of the product. This is why tobacco control and tobacco taxation has achieved a special status and focus in public finance globally, because it is a unique product which is disproportionately harmful compared to other products when consumed as intended by the producer. WHO claims that tobacco kills over 8 million people a year. More than 7 million of those deaths, they say, are a result of direct tobacco use, while about 1.2 million are the result of non-smokers being exposed. So that's a WHO perspective. On that, Colombo University, very importantly, has done a study on the social cost and the economic costs of tobacco. Professor Amala de Silva, who led the study, is with us today. So I will not tell you the broad results of that study, which also suggests that the total amount of taxes collected from tobacco are less than the economic and social cost of cigarette smoking in the country. So Professor Amala Silva will say a little bit about the findings of that study when she comes in later. There is, of course, consequently, a global consensus enshrined in what's called the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, FCTC, to which Sri Lanka is also a signatory. And the Framework Convention is based on the idea that there is a net benefit to any society from reducing the consumption of tobacco, which is mainly administered or consumed through cigarettes. So that's sort of the main delivery device of tobacco in terms of human consumption is through cigarettes. When we talk about the industrial interest, it is mainly in Sri Lanka, Ceylon Tobacco Company, which is a monopoly producer. And of course, I think one thing to remember when analyzing the problem in Sri Lanka versus somewhere else in the world is that the profit maximization criteria for a monopolist is not based on pricing in a competitive market. And market price is also not determined, as some may think, by the government. So often, I think when you read the newspapers and the media, there is this sense that government is setting the price of cigarettes. Actually, government only sets the taxes, and it is Ceylon Tobacco that sets the price of a cigarette. And we will see later how tobacco has increased prices quite aggressively, well in excess of taxes throughout the history of cigarette pricing in Sri Lanka. So, and the reason to do that, it's in a monopoly market, it is generally not in the industry's interest to keep prices low. It is mainly to keep taxes low relative to price, okay? We come just to cap the fiscal interest, and the fiscal interest emerges really from the revenue that the government gains from tobacco. You can see on the left-hand side the number of cigarettes sold, the total tax on cigarettes, tax as a percentage of recurrent expenditure, and even as recently as 2015 and 16, the government recovered in almost 5%, or a little over that, or a little less than that, of the recurrent expenditure from the taxation of the cigarettes in Sri Lanka. Of course, that has fallen down a little bit recently, mainly because taxes haven't increased, prices haven't increased, and even though the inflation and nominal GDP does increase with time. So let me summarize in the next slide. The fiscal interest is higher tax revenue, and often we come across this in trying to optimize the policy for the country. The social interest is reduction in consumption. In many developed countries, as tobacco or cigarettes are seen as a sunset industry. And in developed markets, cigarette companies also function like that, assuming that this industry will ultimately have to stop producing somewhere in the future. It's not a growing industry, even though it's a growing industry in the developing world or the poorer world. And the industry interest, of course, is to have a reasonable set of policies and higher profits, as it naturally would be. So what I'm going to present next is an interesting thought that the interests of industry, the interests of society, and the interests of government has a convergence condition, that they all converge when an economic variable turns out in the way that I'm describing. So when we say when the price elasticity of demand is less than 1, and here's what it means. You see it written in blue underneath. Price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in consumption in response to a percentage change in price. So when price increases by 10%, if consumption changes by 10%, we say there's a price elasticity of demand, PED I will call it, of 1. When the consumption response is a smaller percentage than the price change, then we say the price elasticity of demand is less than 1. What it really means is that if you increase, say, the price by 10%, the total revenue collected from cigarettes doesn't fall. Even though consumption drops, it doesn't drop by 10%. and the total revenue therefore increases, right? So when the fall in consumption is smaller than the increase in price, for any price increase, the total revenue collected from the cigarette increases. So when price elasticity is less than 1, what it means is that you can simultaneously reduce consumption, which is in the social interest. You can have higher tax revenue to government, which is in the fiscal interest. And depending on how that increased revenue is shared, you can also have a higher net of tax revenue or profit to the industry. So technically, and this is what's been happening, I think, the history of cigarette pricing and taxation as well, that effectively increases in taxes lead to higher revenue to government, also to higher profits to industry, while achieving reduced consumption at the same time. And that is really what's important in terms of a price elasticity of demand being less than 1. The price elasticity of demand that we use in this particular, in our research, is about 0.5. Now that is, it's quite difficult to estimate price elasticity of demand. There are global studies on this that looks at what the general price elasticity of demand is, simply because demand responds to other factors as well, education, fashion, culture, etc. But what is the price impact on demand is really the critical question to ask when setting taxes on tobacco. And that is not just a little less than 1, it's substantially less than 1. It is 0.5, and doing estimations based on that and doing revenue estimates based on that calculation has generally yielded correct results. So which is why we stay with the 0.5 price elasticity of demand. Okay. Now I'm going to kind of get into the next section of just explaining the history of ad hoc and suboptimal taxation of cigarettes before we come to the solution, which is the price formula. Excise taxes. So cigarettes are taxed in various ways, and I'll first talk about what we call the excise tax on cigarettes. It's a special absolute tax that is placed on cigarettes. It's based on the length of a cigarette, and there are 5 length bands that the excise law uses, and each band gets a different amount of tax. On the next slide, what you see is the frequency of tax changes. And what you see here, we said this section is about ad hoc and suboptimal taxation. What you see in this frequency is that it's very unpredictable. In 2011, you see 3 changes, 12 you see 3 changes, 13 you see 2 changes, 14 you see 2 changes. So 15, 16. So sometimes the price doesn't change at all. There are small tax changes to some cigarettes, not others. 2017, you have 0 changes. 18, you have 1 change. And what the next slide will show you is that these changes that we're highlighting actually just happen, at quite different percentages on different cigarettes as well. So, for instance, you can see that the most sold cigarette is 72 to 84 millimeters in length. That's the one before the last column. And then there's the second most sold cigarette is the first row, sorry, one before the last row and the first row. And you can see that in that first row, there are only 2 tax changes, or twice that the tax changes, once in 2014 and once in 2016 in this 5-year range or 6-year range that we've looked at. Whereas so some brands change only twice, other brands change more frequently. The percentage changes are quite different. You can see in 2019 on the last 3 columns, that there's one band that the tax increases 92%, then reduces 12%, then reduces 32%. So those last 2 are negative on the second row, last 2 columns. Those are negative numbers. So there is a sense of volatility and erraticness, not just unpredictability, to the way that tax changes have been determined. Just to tell you, what the tax and price components of cigarette are, this is just simply taking 2019 when VAT and NBT applied to cigarettes. right at the end, we had a price, there was no NBT, that's just VAT of 8%. The excise tax came to 64%, so total of about 72%. Actually, I think this has to add up to about 74%. There's a number wrong, and a net tax price of about 74%, 26%. So basically, I'll show you the history briefly in the next couple of slides. What you see is that the part of the cigarette sold, the part that goes to the cigarette company, has been around 26, 25, 24%. It has on average, whereas the government has got about 75%. Okay. So the next slide actually also shows you how taxes of cigarettes have grown faster, or the percentage of the price or the amount that the tobacco company collects from a cigarette has tended to grow faster than the amount that the government collects from a cigarette. So in fact, the tax in price ratio has come down over time. And this is looking at it from 2005 onwards. And I won't talk through every number, but what you see is that what CTC has collected in terms of the net of tax price. So see, what CTC collects is we call the net of tax price, but the government collects is the tax in price. So we can see for different cigarettes how they performed. What CTC collected grew 10.7 times for the cheapest brand, in contrast to what the government collected, which grew only 7.3 times in a 10-year period that we looked at. So this was a study we published after 2015. Likewise, for the most sold brand, what CTC collected grew 8.7 times, while what the government collected grew only 5.3 times. So this means that CTC's revenue per cigarette has been growing at a higher rate or much faster than the revenue per cigarette to the government, once again indicating suboptimal taxation. So prices are going up, but the proportion of the price that is collected by the tobacco company has been growing much faster than the proportion of the price that is collected by the government. And so these are indications, when you look at these numbers, that taxes have been suboptimal. Part of that is captured in the next slide, where you see the history of average total tax in price. So this is the tax in price history. Overall, the average is about 75.3%, and we use that as a benchmark in determining how to tax cigarettes, because ultimately you target a price to meet the social interest, but then if you take a tax of 75%, then after that the taxation methodology is a way of targeting price. You can see that this, while it is hovering around that total 75% mark. And the reason we look at it this way is, it's not correct to look at only excise taxes, because if you add VAT, NBT, and VAT and NBT taxes can change regularly. You've obviously got to adjust your excise taxes to compensate for changes in VAT and NBT. And what the government really needs to target is the total tax on a cigarette, and not any particular form of taxing cigarettes. And that's how the taxation formula and methodology needs to be designed. So you can see periods in which actually the taxing price was as high as 85%. And then it has come down to a little less than 75%. There were some periods or some points in history when it was under 70% as well. But it's mostly been above 70% and mostly been below 85% or below 80%. So it's between the 70 to 80% band that government has had tax in price. And the average rate has been 75%. So the real problem is not about the tax in price if you get 75% tax in price. It is really about how the tax is targeted to increase the prices then, because that determines the total taxes that are collected, and part of the problems arise from not increasing the taxes adequately to drive increases in prices. So what you see is that tobacco company has increased price more aggressively than government has increased taxes. So if you look at 1985 and 2005 onwards, when tax in price was 85%, It's not because government is reducing the taxes, government is increasing taxes. However, tobacco companies increasing the price faster than the government is increasing the tax, which is why the tax in price comes down, okay? And why does the tobacco company increase price faster than the government increases tax, or at a higher rate? Also because with the price elasticity of demand of less than 1, the tobacco company revenue, of course, increases because the fall in consumption is more than offset by the increased revenue collected by the increase in price. So there's a logic to why that happens in a market, in any product where price elasticity of demand is less than 1, which is the case of cigarettes. And this also explains, many people ask us, why is it that tobacco companies' stocks keep going up, prices keep going up, while there's a lot of noise in the media about taxes being too high and the company not being able to survive. These are, of course, unanalyzed conversations in the media, not well informed by research. What the research shows is that it makes a lot of sense that as prices go up and even as consumption can come down, that profits will go up, and it will go up especially because the tax in price has increased, the net of tax price has increased faster than the tax in price, which is why you don't see the same growth in benefits to government revenue as you see to the profits of Ceylon Tobacco Company over a long period of time. Okay. We get into the formula and sort of talk through how to think about a formula and the particular problems that need to be solved in designing a formula for cigarettes. If I will take a 10-second pause to make sure that I have power on my computer. Yeah. Coming to the formula that we want to present to you. So the basis of the formula is regular adjustment in pricing, free from the ad hoc nature of the current system. Okay. What we pointed out as the current system, the way the taxation happened is rather ad hoc. There doesn't seem to be a particular method for determining how much to increase the tax, how often to increase the tax, and how frequent, that's the frequency, and how to actually apply the tax across different cigarettes. We said there were 5 cigarette bands as well. So regular adjustment in pricing, a systematic adjustment, free from the ad hoc nature of the current system would be one goal. The second goal is some logical and transparent for policy, free from undue political discretion or bureaucratic discretion. So the part of the problem, and this is in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, actually it mandates all sorts of firewalls between officials of government, politicians, and tobacco companies. Because when any single company is able to through its sale of its products, amass so much revenue to government or pay so much in tax, you can see that the company would have a very, very high incentive to influence the decisions of politicians and policymakers in its favor. As we have seen, the price in tax has come down over time, right? Now, Sri Lanka doesn't actually, even though we've signed the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, we don't put into practice many of the guidelines in that Framework Convention. And Verité has published a detailed analysis of how the National Authority on Tobacco Control can take more actions and more constructive actions to actually put the commitments on the Framework Convention into effect and benefit from that as well. So transparency of a policy, free from the influence that can come on bureaucracy, on political decisions, is quite important and is anticipated in the global commitments as well. Also adaptable based on government policy. So government should be free, of course, to set policy and say, well, government policy could be, we don't want to reduce consumption, we want to reduce consumption. So the policy formula has to be a little bit flexible in terms of allowing government to determine policy and then have a logical, transparent, regular system of application, right? The challenges in developing a formula, and I think everybody who's tried to do this faces certain challenges. That is to say, what is the criteria on which cigarette prices should be updated through a formula? Normally, any formula indexes something. When we have a fuel formula, you index it on the Singapore Platts price of fuel. So what is it that a cigarette price should be indexed on? Okay. Even when you determine what to index it on, and of course there the answers are quite familiar. It is on inflation or GDP, and we'll come to that. Well, but what base year should be applied to an index? How do you determine whether to index it on what prices were in 2010 or 2005 or to 1995? How do you determine what the right year is on which to base your index, right? Then thirdly, how should the index be calibrated to different types of cigarettes? So even if you develop the index for one cigarette, then how does it apply to other cigarettes? Or can you develop index separately for different cigarettes? So these are the kind of questions that arise. I think that are important technical questions to manage or agree on when determining a formula. So let me just tell you something that actually the government did in the 2019 budget proposals, that is before the government changed. The government actually did announce a formula for cigarette taxation. So we say one step forward, mainly to indicate that there may have been another step backward later when they didn't fully implement the formula. But the 2019 budget announced that excise taxes on cigarettes would follow an indexation method. What was indexed is, of course, the increase in taxes, because if you think of taxes as being a percentage of price, then it automatically could help to drive price. That was anticipated. But it didn't define really formally a base year for that indexation, and it didn't adequately define how it would calibrate that indexation across different types of cigarettes. So that was a weakness in the formula that actually was presented. Now, Verité itself published a formula, and that's what's in the working paper that you can link to on the chat of the seminar. And what I'm going to do now is actually talk you through the aspects of the framework that Verité published. Okay? So the next slide shows that there were three aspects, that we're going to talk to the theoretical framework, how to apply consumer theory to updating prices and taxes, benchmarking the most consumed cigarette. So we take the cigarette with the highest market share and benchmark it by applying consumer theory, and then figure out how to do the price differentials and the tax, and thereby the tax differentials between cigarettes. So in all the thinking, I'm going to shift to price now on the basis that the target tax would be 75% of price. And then let's look at how price should be targeted. And effectively, that means we also know how tax should be targeted. Okay. So updating prices, okay. So to know how to update prices with the social interest in mind, we have to know how prices actually impact demand. Economic consumer theory has two big ideas on this. One is called the income effect. That is, when the buying power of a person increases, they consume more. The other is called the substitution effect. That is that when relative prices change between two goods, you tend to buy what is cheaper, or buy more of what is cheaper and buy less of what is more expensive. So consumer theory basically has it that we can compute demand impact by analyzing income and substitution effects. And that is really what you must take into co-consideration theoretically in determining prices, right? Of course, with cigarettes, there's a two-part substitution effect, which I want to explain in the next slide. So it's not just substitution between a cigarette and other goods, which is the second one, but also the substitution between different brands of cigarettes, which is why we said the second criteria is important. It's not important not only to set the price of a cigarette, of a particular cigarette, but to know how to adjust the prices of other cigarettes in relation to it. Because if people substitute from more expensive cigarettes to cheaper cigarettes, that affects then the fiscal interest as well. And also it affects the social interest of trying to reduce demand and consumption. So we offer three methods in the next slide for government to deal with the problem of reducing demand or the policy environment. One is called the minimum policy, and that is consumption of cigarettes increases in line with increased consumption of all other goods, right? So that's a simple approach where you allow consumption of cigarettes to increase, but no more than what the consumption of all other goods. So you index it that way. The moderate policy would be a discouraging the increasing of consumption of cigarettes, but not necessarily making sure it reduces, but making sure it doesn't increase, discouraging increase at the same rate as consumption of other goods. So you'd have a reduced increase potentially, and possibly a decrease in the consumption of cigarettes in the moderate policy. In the aggressive policy, it's a pricing policy that ensures decreasing cigarette consumption over time. Okay, so government should determine which of these three policies it wants. Does it want to aggressively reduce consumption over time? Does it want to simply allow cigarette consumption to increase in line with the general increase of goods and services in the country? Or would it like a moderate policy where cigarette consumption can increase, but not as much as consumption of other goods? The minimum policy is very simple theoretically to design. It would be a pricing policy where the consumption of cigarettes increase in line with increased consumption of other goods, where you allow the income effect to exist, but you make sure there's no substitution effect. So all you've got to do for a minimum policy, and you see the formula, to make sure that the price of cigarettes increase in line with inflation. Now, what's interesting is the government often fails to do even this, right? That maybe lentils and beans and potatoes go up in price by a certain percentage, but cigarettes don't go up at the same rate. So in the last year, we've had a 6% increase in inflation, but actually we have had no inflation, no increase in cigarette prices. So effectively that violates even the minimum criteria that the price of a cigarette should go up in line with the price of all other goods in the economy, right? At least in line with that. And so that's why we've said that the policy tends to be ad hoc, because often there are long periods in which even the minimum policy or the minimum criteria is not achieved by the way cigarettes are taxed, and taxes are what then drives the increase in price. Okay. The moderate policy would be a little more aggressive, where the price of a cigarette is increased not only in line with inflation, but also with GDP growth, per capita GDP growth. That is somehow, reducing the impact of the income effect, such that if a person spent all their money on cigarettes, 100%, then they would be able to buy no more cigarettes than they were able to buy the previous year, because the price increases with per capita income. So if my per capita income goes up by 10%, I would increase cigarette prices by 10%, and per capita income obviously is expected to go up at a slightly higher rate than inflation when there's GDP growth. So that gives you this formula, and I won't get into the economic theory of why the outcomes are what we say on the left-hand side, but it creates a little bit of a substitution effect, right? So the income effect is reduced, because the reason there is an income effect is the overall purchasing power of a person goes up, unless they are spending all their money on cigarettes. If they're only spending 50% of their money on cigarettes or 10% of their money on cigarettes, in the balance 90% of their spend, their purchasing power has gone up because per capita GDP has increased more than the prices in the market. So when total purchasing power is higher, people feel richer, and they can still want to consume more cigarettes as well. But of course, because you've increased cigarette prices at a higher rate than other goods, there's a substitution, countervailing substitution effect, which then makes a person want to consume relatively slightly less cigarettes to other goods. And whether a person ends up consuming more cigarettes or less cigarettes under this moderate policy would determine on sort of individual factors, whether it is the income effect or substitution effect which dominates, right? And that can change from person to person as well, which is why this is a moderate policy. It doesn't guarantee that it will reduce, but it does have the possibility of reducing consumption, and it certainly dampens consumption more than the minimum policy would. In the aggressive policy, you would adjust to also the percentage of the budget that people put on cigarettes to completely negate the income effect that a person has, so that you take away, you increase the price of cigarettes so much that at the current level of expenditure on cigarettes, they can buy no more cigarettes, not if they spend all their income on cigarettes, but at the current budget share that they place on cigarettes, that they can consume no more cigarettes than before the price increase, even after per capita GDP has increased. Right. In this case, it's aggressive policy, and it is generally highly likely that, or it will be almost certain that consumption decreases if you follow this approach, because the income effect is zero, and the substitution effect gets people to consume less cigarettes relative to other goods, because cigarette prices have gone up much more. So if you apply this to a simple case scenario, what you'll have is that, let's take a person with average monthly income of 60,000 and spends maybe 20% of their budget on cigarettes. Inflation is 6%, per capita GDP is 5%, which is sort of what Sri Lanka is targeting at the moment. The minimum policy would see a price increase of 6% every year, accounting just for inflation. The moderate policy would ask for a price increase of 11% every year, accounting for inflation plus real GDP growth. And the aggressive policy, that is, if you really want to ensure that the pricing leads to lower demand for cigarettes, that would require a price increase of 32% under these criteria. So a very, very high price increase in terms of making sure that demand didn't increase and that demand actually reduced. So of course, government is free to choose whichever policy model they would like. Verité itself has recommended or sort of gone with analysis on the moderate policy, right? So most countries, I think, would say the minimum policy is too minimalistic, and that's not what is followed even in international sort of guidance on cigarette taxation. The aggressive policy is, of course, very aggressive. And Verité has defaulted to suggesting that Sri Lanka look at the moderate policy, or at least done the math for the moderate policy, because then we can think how to go forward from there. And this is what I've already shown you on what the moderate policy looks like. Okay. But having agreed on the policy that Sri Lanka should, benchmark cigarette taxes to prices plus GDP growth, how do you decide, which year to use as your base year in setting that index? Okay, and how do you go about deciding? Is it last year's prices that you should increase by GDP? Is it the previous years? Is the price 10 years ago that you should benchmark? So we thought it's quite important to come up with a systematic way of looking at that, and that is what I'm going to present next. Okay. So what we have done is we've developed a benchmark based on the historical price movements in relation to per capita GDP. The question we ask is, what is the price point that is most consistent with evaluating past prices as having been, on average, adjusted in line with per capita GDP? So that's a lot to kind of process when I say it that way. But basically what we are saying is, look, let's look at the past. Maybe we have increased prices, significantly in keeping with per capita GDP. And let's look at it in a sympathetic way that the history guides us. So if there is a year in which, when we use that year as a benchmark, what we have done looks like what we want to do, then that's a pretty good benchmark to use. That's basically what this means. So to kind of do a historical analysis like that, of course, the longest running brand of cigarettes with data, because tobacco company also changes brands regularly, is what you call the John Player Gold Leaf brand. It has data. We have data for it from 1980. It is also the most popular brand of cigarettes in Sri Lanka, with a market share of over 80% for most of history. Of course, recently the tobacco company has been introducing new cigarettes at a lower price and reducing the market share of John Player Gold Leaf, but historically it's averaged 80% or more. And we use this period 1980 to 2000 to set the benchmark, mainly because, of course, some of this work was developed when I was on a presidential committee in the 1990s, late 1990s, to actually help the government develop a policy for tobacco taxation. And of course, there was a lot of, even when you look at history, the taxation policy after 2000 has become quite erratic. And there was a certain, systematic behavior in the taxation up to 2000. One would say that the influence of that bureaucrats have come under in terms of setting taxes have been more severe, it seems, after 2000. And 20 years is anyway a long period, and we've done the analysis for that period of time. So the benchmarking methodology really is what I described to you, right? And what we're doing is we are saying, look, we'll test every possible year from 1980 to 2000 as a suitable benchmark, and use the year that becomes the year that is closest to having adopted the policy. So if there's a year when we benchmark it, actually the actual behavior and actual implementation of cigarette taxes, looks like that year is the best benchmark we can have, then let's use that year. Okay. So what you see on the slide is actually how we went about it. We tested every single year to say, well, if we benchmark this year, how did taxes and how did the actual price deviate from the ideal price that we would have had if we applied the formula? And the gap between the actual price and the ideal price is what we are calculating from the difference function. And we picked the year with the lowest gap, right? So of course, nobody applied a formula, but what year is a suitable benchmark to use in which if we had applied the formula, then it looks like we would have applied it based on that year. Okay, so we are really using history as a guidance in doing that. And so this difference function that I put up is the gap between applying the formula and what actually happened. And then we do that for every single year. That's the next slide. Okay. And what we get is that historical data point shows that 1981 is the most suitable year for benchmarking a cigarette tax formula. And here's what the gap between actual and history looks like when you use 1981. That's on the next slide. It looks almost perfect, right? You can see that actually the policy from 1980 to 2000, the actual prices followed what would have happened very closely, tracked what would have happened if you had actually applied the same formula, which suggests that if we had applied the formula, we'd have got what happened, and the application of the formula is very similar in that period when you use 1981 as a benchmark, which suggests that that could have been maintained for the future as well. Okay, but interestingly, it wasn't maintained after 2000. Okay. And what you see here in the next slide is how affordability. So the previous slide, if you go back a little bit, it really shows, the indexation between affordability, that affordability increases and price increases were pretty much similar. And what this next slide shows you is, kind of a zoomed in look at that. So that it was not entirely perfect, but that dotted line, which is at 1981, was also, the affordability was exactly the same in 2000. I'm using the word affordability because when you actually index to inflation and per capita GDP, so I'm using affordability as the shortened form to say that. Okay, so effectively from 1980 to 2000 or 1981 to 2000, you functioned in that 20 years as if you had indexed prices to affordability and taxes to achieve that price. But after 2000, things became a lot more erratic. And what you see in this graph is how it played out in different directions, where affordability has increased a lot more. So really from 1981 to 2000, affordability of, per capita GDP, you could buy 9,500 cigarettes effectively. That's how you look at affordability. And it has increased all the way up to 17,800 at the peak. And now gone down to 12,124 in 2018, where we did the math for this. So really, affordability is still much higher than what the benchmark would allow. And applying this benchmark and applying the formula, would then work to bring affordability back to the 9,500 level. Okay, now we come to the last problem to solve. If you solve the problem of what to use to index, that is affordability, inflation plus per capita GDP. If you solve the problem of what year to use as a benchmark, and we did that by taking a 20-year range and actually testing every year to say, it's the same method we use in regression analysis. You look for the least gap or best fit. And the best fit year turns out to be 1981. It turns out to have actually worked that way for 20 years, which makes it a very sound historical basis to use as a benchmark. But we have that data only for John Player Gold Leaf. So how do we actually apply this then to other cigarettes that are there, because we have 5 bands of cigarettes, right? So what we suggest in the next one is that there is a very simple way to think about it. Because cigarettes taxes are distinguished by length and prices are distinguished by length, and simply adjusting the tax and price to the length, making a ratio of the length would be potentially a suitable method to set the taxes and prices, right? So the next slide says that the differentiation by length is the current method used by government. Brands have varying lifespans, so you shouldn't use brands because a brand is here today, gone tomorrow. New brands appear within the same length categories. These things can change regularly. But using the length category provides an element of predictability even for the producer. They know if I produce at this length, this is my tax, this is the targeted price. Of course, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control advises that you get rid of having too many length tax bands. Sri Lanka has too many, is the general consensus of WHO studies and reports as well. But while you have these bands, then the length becomes a suitable way to set the taxes for other cigarettes. So that gives you a very simple formula in the next slide that you say, well, here are the tax length bands. You index it to the upper limit of the length band, and then you set the price to be a ratio of the length and the tax to be, of course, a ratio of price. What you can see in the next slide is how Sri Lanka hasn't actually implemented even this effectively. So let's take the JPGL or John Player Gold Leaf cigarette. So there, since we're using that as an index or the benchmark, and it is the most sold brand, you say, look, the applicable tax rate is correct based on the cigarette length. That's what we've derived. Then what should the applicable tax rate be for the other cigarettes? You can see the orange line is substantially lower or shorter than the blue line. So if you use the length-based taxation as a way of calibrating taxes between cigarettes, then the taxes on all other brands actually needs to increase substantially from the current level. Now, I'll take a quick aside and say one of the things that you often hear when people talk about increasing the price of cigarettes, and policymakers seem quite convinced by this, is that, look, BD consumption will go up and you will lose revenue. Okay, so let me just, and we published on this as well, let me just talk you through this one. The price difference between the capstan, the cheapest cigarette, and the most sold cigarette, is actually 45 rupees. The most sold cigarette goes for 65, the cheapest cigarette goes for 20. And the difference in tax collected is 30 rupees. But the price difference between say a BD and the cheapest cigarette is actually about 15 rupees, and the tax difference is about 14 rupees. Well, it can't be more than 15 anyway, even if you didn't tax it at all. So this shows you that the real risk to government revenue, or the major risk to government revenue, is not substitution from the lowest price cigarette to BD, but actually substitution from the high price cigarette to the lowest price cigarette, because you will lose 45 rupees every time a person substitutes from JPGL, say, to capstan, the lowest priced. You will lose only 14 rupees when a person substitutes from capstan to BD. So keeping capstan low to try and prevent the substitution to BD results potentially in losing a great deal more in the much more likely substitution, because BD in a sense is not considered to be in the same class of cigarettes. It doesn't have the same social acceptance as cigarettes. But substituting from a high price cigarette to a low price cigarette is a much more likely substitution, and it is far more costly. So maintaining this price differential to try and prevent the growth of BD actually may not make a lot of sense, because what you're losing is a lot more than what you are gaining, even if you did gain it. And what the next slide shows, you may not be gaining it at all. Data on BD shows that we can track sort of BD consumption by looking at the importation of tendu leaf, which is what is used in the production of BD. Importation of tendu leaf has been slightly declining over a long period of time. There's a little volatility, but overall it's coming down. Cigarette consumption has come down faster, mainly led by, of course, increases in prices and taxes, but not only, but also a lot by education, global culture change, etc. But what you can see is that there is no evidence for BD consumption increasing in the country. And often what is presented in media and newspapers are not based on research findings that have been subject to any kind of academic discussion or scrutiny. And that's unfortunate. But I think it's very important to see the data and be aware that there is no evidence of the growing consumption of BD in the country. And this is data over 30 years, right? So really, let me summarize and end here very quickly, that the proposed methodology that we are talking about is that you apply the taxation to the increase in taxation, that you index it to per capita GDP, real growth in per capita GDP. That you target price in doing this, but keep taxation as 75% of the price, which is what Sri Lanka has done on average over a very long period of time. Taxation, in fact, has been significantly high. It's gone even up to 85% of price, but Sri Lanka has maintained an average of 75% of price over a long period. So maintain that. So it's a very moderate approach that we are taking here, not to hit the highest level of taxation, but to take the average level over a long period in a way. And this is adaptable to government policy, but Verité itself is saying, maintain affordability rather than aggressively discouraging consumption by using the most aggressive method. But of course, it can be adapted. So government can always do a little bit more if it wants to reduce consumption. But this gives you a benchmark. It's based on a clear historical relationship between GDP per capita and cigarette pricing that has existed. And we picked a 1981 benchmark to say that there is enough evidence that this is doable and has been done for 20 years up to the year 2000, except that policy has been subject to a lot more volatility and ad hocism since then, and that needs to be fixed. And the last is that it also provides a logical method by using the length as the criteria for adjusting tax and price between cigarettes, that it gives you a logical method to do so. When we did that, I'll just show you again the slide we had. We would certainly recover that trend that we had for 20 years from 1980 to 2000, bring affordability down a little bit from where it is today. And more importantly, what the next slide shows is that if it was applied, we would increase revenue from tobacco taxation by at least 20 billion a year. So the increase would be a little over 20 billion. It would have been 20 billion in 2019. It wasn't applied. It would be a little over 20 in 2020. And using Verité's medium-term fiscal framework, we project forward, and it increases to really above 25 billion a year in 2023. So there is a substantial loss in revenue to government, which of course then has to be made up by taxation or by debt, because everything that the government doesn't earn in revenue today has to be met by either future taxation, different taxation, or increased debt for which Sri Lanka pays. And this is a sensible approach based on a transparent, consistent, logical method based on historical norms by which cigarette taxation can be taxed on a formula annually to increase the revenue of government. And this has the advantage of, improving the social benefit by not allowing consumption to go up too much and even helping to reduce consumption. And as we have seen, it doesn't necessarily undermine the profit incentives of the industry either. I mean, it doesn't allow the industry to make more profits, hopefully, than the government does. So currently, the industry profits have been growing faster. The revenue to industry has been growing faster. But in this method, at least, government can ensure that the revenue to government is maintained at least equal or higher level than the increased profits to the industry. And that would be the goal of a sensible public policy. And we want to thank you for listening to us and take a pause before I invite Amala and Harani to speak. Can I just pause for a second and just ask my team whether there have been any clarificatory questions or anything that has appeared on the chat that I can quickly answer before we hand over to our respondents. So only if there's a clarification question. Amala, I can see you on the screen, so let me hand over to you and maybe come to the questions later. So Professor Amala de Silva is a professor of economics at the Department of Economics in the University of Colombo. Her expertise includes public finance, macroeconomics, health, poverty, and inequality. She's in the social sector, one of the most respected and engaged economists the country has, and an academic. So I think, Amala, I may need to mute my mic before you speak. And so thank you, Amala, for joining us today. And let me welcome you to make I'm sorry we've given you such a short time to make your remarks, but I'm sure we can engage in question and answer too. Let me invite you to make your remarks on the presentation. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Nishan, and thank you for that lovely introduction, which I hope I deserve. I actually enjoyed listening to you and reading through the working paper. And just to start off by talking about what you mentioned about the study I was involved in. It wasn't University of Colombo, but we were actually a large group of people from very different backgrounds getting together to work on the issue of economic and social costs of tobacco and alcohol in Sri Lanka. And it was a very interesting piece of work, because at the end of it, we found, if you want the number, it was done in 2015, and that for example, in terms of rupees, 89.37 billion was lost in terms of economic cost due to tobacco alone. In US dollars as well, 662 million. And that's a large amount. And what is more interesting than that was the final conclusion that we reached, that the direct and indirect economic costs of alcohol and tobacco are substantial, and that these costs far exceed the direct revenue obtained by the government through taxation. So it is very important for the government to be conscious of the costs that are incurred in terms of tobacco and alcohol when we don't really work to reduce the consumption. But I'm very much happy with the approach that's taken by Nishan in thinking that the government's primary objective is to maximize revenue. When you look at the excise department and what it's talking about in the papers about how the COVID lockdown has caused their revenue to go down, and the fact that the pubs, liquor shops are open even before the lockdown ended, shows that there is a big consciousness on the part of the excise department, who represent the government, about the issue of revenue. So using the issue of maximizing their revenue is, I think, would be from their point of view a very important issue. So I'm hoping that your Mila Sutra will be more popular than the Mila Sutras of the past, because I think everyone who is a non-smoker will actually be quite happy with the way you're thinking about it, because particularly the way you look at the issue of affordability. Because if it is too affordable, then who gets drawn into using tobacco would be generally poor people and new entrants to the market. So addressing affordability is very important, not only from an economic point of view, but also from the social perspective. So I found it very interesting the way you look at it from the income effect and the substitution effect, because I thought there was the substitution effect right now, cost of living has gone up on lots of fronts, but not tobacco. And if someone goes out there and thinks about what to do with their money, I mean, it's going to be tempting to buy a cigarette because bakery goods have gone up in price. And if you want to have something nice to eat or drink, you'll obviously have to spend more than you do with your cigarettes. So therefore, the income effect and substitution effect you talk about, I think, are very important. So you also in your paper, but you mentioned the issue about how much cigarette taxation is part of government revenue. It's not something you touched on here, but I would feel that that would be a very strong argument as well to add to the debate, because that is something that would be very understandable for the government, and it would be very important to bring up that issue as well. And this fact that the tripartite, all three parties are going to benefit from your equation. I think that's a very strong point you're making, and I mean, I found the methodology quite convincing. And I just had a few points that I was interested in about the issue of, I mean, you're thinking about economic growth, but when there is a situation where economic goes down, what do you think will happen to the issue? I think we need to think, I mean, there is inflation right now to counteract the lack of economic growth, but if you have both going in one direction, what would happen? So also, like, once you fix the taxes, fix the prices, you will find that each of these parties will try to actually argue for changes inside that equation. And who would you expect to be the arbitrator in this context? Because from an institutional perspective, I mean, the formula itself and is very scientific and logical, but I think there has to be an institutional party involved as well to make it work. And last of all, I think I'm happy you're going for the moderate one rather than the aggressive one, because there I had the issue of how are you going to think about the proportion of income spent? Are you going to go for means or moons, or which of that, which I think doesn't come up if you go for the moderate equation. So I think by and large, it's a very interesting and well thought out. The problem is set out well, and you have to come up with what to me seems a very sound formula. So I will stop there and hope that you'll answer the two questions I raised, and also that others will have interesting questions to provide you to give you some more food for thought. But I think the sutra should be a good way forward for the country. Thank you, Nishan.
Amala, thank you, Amala, very much. Before I go to Harani, let me summarize your questions. Who is the arbitrator of the decision? And the second question was it about the percentage of revenue or government expenditure? And there was one more question, I think.
Yeah. The third one was, what would you do in times of if there's, economic
disinflation? Yeah. Harani, if you don't mind, let me just answer them very quickly because they all have quick answers. There is so when we were on a presidential committee, task force, whatever you call it, in the 90s, and we actually recommended an authority which is called the National Authority on Tobacco and Alcohol, and based on the recommendations of the commission, actually such a authority was created by President Mahinda Rajapaksa in 2005 or 6, I think. And so I would say that authority is a suitable arbitrator of a decision, and really the capability to do and to arbitrate, to be the arbitrator, probably that is the government authority that's available to do that. Also on the, we did actually, there was a slide that I showed, I may have gone through it really fast. Tobacco taxes are accounting for about 5% of government expenditure, recurrent expenditure right now. And so that's quite a big chunk if you're getting 1/20th of a recurrent expenditure. And on the rare occasion that you have negative growth, we've still never had a negative nominal growth. So as you said, it's inflation plus GDP. So even last year, nominal GDP remained about the same, right? So you had a negative 3.6% growth, but actually inflation that's higher than that. So in a way, that problem would be very rare, in which case you'd probably, not increase taxes at all that year, and wait for the formula, wait for things to catch up right, before increasing a grade. But great questions. Thank you so much for asking them. Let me just go to Harani, who's a research economist at the Institute of Policy Studies. She works for the migration team and the tobacco control research team at IPS. And Harani, it's great to see you again and have you join this event to make comments. I know that you guys have been thinking about it as well. Harani's colleague Nishan Tilaka, I think unfortunately was caught up in another event and couldn't join us today. And thank you, Harani, for joining. Over to you.
So thank you so much, Nishan, for having me and for the excellent presentation. So I think there's no better time than before a budget to really bring out this discussion, cigarette taxation into public discourse. And in particular, because cigarette taxes have not been sort of raised or adjusted in the past 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. And we know that there have been significant revenue losses in the past from not doing this in a sort of regular manner. So I think developing a technical basis and a sort of systematic policy for taxing cigarettes in the manner in which you have outlined in the working paper and in your presentation is extremely important and relevant. Because I think the government can use these taxes as a way to plug in some of their revenue gap. And of course, it's not going to solve all their revenue problems, but this is one of the quicker and cheaper ways for a government to get in some additional revenue. So I think the paper does a really good job of outlining a rational basis upon which these taxes can be regularized and done in a way without ad hocism through the formula that you recommend. So I have 2 comments. One question I would raise is whether Verité at any point, sort of when doing this work, considered an approach where you just do away with the 5-tier tax system and envision moving to a streamlined structure with a uniform tax. So one tax for all bands, irrespective of length or brand. So, but of course, I understand that your approach was developed with the objective of balancing different interests of these competing different parties. So in that sense, one tax rate for all cigarettes wouldn't necessarily be in the producer's interest, I suppose, but at least in terms of the government's and society's interest to sort of reap these health and fiscal benefits, whether this is also an option to consider. For a few reasons, because this then eliminates this whole issue of having to worry about substitution between brands and perfectly calibrating, the price and tax between them. And also it prevents the producer from manipulating products to fit into, lower taxed tiers and do things like that. And also we know the WHO Framework Convention recommends uniform tax adjustments in addition to this income and inflation adjustments that we are anyway discussing. So I was just curious about Verité's thoughts on this, and is it kind of too ambitious an undertaking? And was the objective to just work around the system that we already have, or was there any other reason? My second comment, I think, was already clarified through Professor Amala's comments also. I was going to say that of the 3 different formulas, I think Verité kind of suggesting the moderate one makes sense, apart from the third one being aggressive, also because when you have the income variable, it might not be practical to do it on a regular basis because we get our income data through HIS maybe once in 3 years. And so that might be an issue. But of course, inflation and GDP data is available regularly. So applying the moderate formula would be convenient and can be done in a regular manner. So those are my 2 comments, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you very much, Harani. And I know IPS has done some great work on this as well and is feeding into the policy discussion. To answer your question on tax bans, absolutely. I mean, we've done a lot more work on this. We've looked at the Framework Convention of Tobacco Control, the gaps in implementing, and it is particularly important that the government think about reducing the tax bans, because tax bans can become gamed to reduce revenue. So that has happened in the last 2 years. So there's a new cigarette called the JPGL Navy Cut. That's a slightly lower band, okay? than the previous cigarette. And what you're seeing is that by the introduction of the Navy cut, the total number of cigarettes are not reduced sold, but actually what the government is earning has reduced because it is at a lower tax level. And that's typically what happens. This is not, while Sri Lankans sort of are experiencing this globally understood problem, which is why the WHO and the Framework Convention recommends getting rid of bans. What we've envisaged is at least on a gradual basis. Every 2 years, you get rid of one ban. So maybe over 5 years or 10 years, you come to one ban. So we understand that shock adjustments can be quite difficult to get agreement on, and it causes too much debate. But it's important to progress in the right direction, and progressing in the right direction would be eliminating bans over time. And if you just simply decided to eliminate one ban every year, even, right, you'd get there faster. You could eliminate one ban every 2 years and get there a little slower. But while you're doing that, then you just still need to calibrate between cigarette bans that exist. And the other reason is, I think, as long as you allow an industry to function legally, you should also treat it with some respect. And eliminating all bans overnight might seem, just unfair in terms of adjustment period, right? So I think just like farmers need a little more time to adjust to organic fertilizer, it's not fair to bring policy that causes huge adjustments all of a sudden. And I think it may be important for government to declare its policy as to eliminate the bans, and then declare a time frame in which that would happen, and then use this method in between to actually set taxes for the different bans as well. So that would be kind of a recommendation of a logical, sensible, respectful approach that the government can take. On your, I think, just remind me your second question again.
It was about the third policy and
that's right, that income effect. Yeah. So actually, there's another criticism that could be brought if you follow the third policy, and that's what you're highlighting. That we don't know. It could go two ways, right? People could, and I've seen this argued by CTC. There are research companies that work for the Ceylon Tobacco as well, and I think the idea that is per capita GDP the right way to understand income. Should we understand income if using a different metric to come across what the income level is? And I think that's a fair question. And when you get to income share, you need to look at HIES data. I think the beauty of this particular approach, as we have presented it or analyzed it, is that Sri Lanka did maintain per capita GDP indexation for 20 years effectively. And nobody cried foul, or nobody said that the world has ended, or cigarette companies have run into a crisis or calamity. So any policy that has been followed effectively for 20 years is a policy that can be followed for another 20 years or 30 years as well, right? And I think, so we don't have to go back to income or trying to figure out income when data is not available. It's very hard to kind of try and calibrate it that way. Income reporting is not very reliable also. Because people underreport income in general. So you get into all kinds of problems. But this is a very sensible method because it is really saying it is the increase in per capita GDP. So even if you don't know what actual income is, or even if it is lower, the increases are likely to track per capita GDP increases. And so it is really the change we are indexing. Right, and then the benchmark works really well because on that benchmark we managed to effectively function successfully for 20 years. And so that should be then a reasonable basis for functioning beyond that period as well. So thank you very much for all those who joined, and we look forward to meeting you again on future seminars of Verité Research. Thank you.